Enovid, the world's first birth control, ushered in a new era of sexual autonomy for women. It was marketed as a safe, clinically tested way to take control of reproductive health. The pill had a bright future, but its past is intertwined with eugenics and colonialism. Its clinical trials took place not in the mainland United States, but in Puerto Rico, where strong women were given a strong formulation of the drug without being told that they were taking part in a trial or about any of the risks that they'd face. What is going on, everyone? This is the Leo podcast, where we talk about various educational topics, especially those impacting the Latin American community. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the first birth control pill and its dark past of using Puerto Rican women as guinea pigs. These trials are a major component in the history of the development of female oral contraceptives that are not often talked about, and today we're going to go over the history behind the birth control pill, the key figures behind these trials, and the impact that it had on Puerto Rican women. I'm your host, Kevin Munoz. This is today's free episode. If you want early access to episodes and bonus episodes, you can find that right now on our patreon.com/latinamericaneo. And if not, then enjoy this one. In 1873, the United States government passed a series of legislation commonly known as the Comstock Laws. The Comstock Laws not only criminalized the use of the postal services as means of obtaining or sending anything considered obscene or salacious, like books containing sexual language, but it also prevented the usage of contraceptives by the general public. Legislation, however, did not prevent women or businesses from continuing to explore and attempt different methods of birth control. These unregulated contraceptives and abortive methods often led to the death and unintentional sterilization of many women. Infuriated by the lengths that many had to go in order to regulate their own fertility, women began to push for legal rights to contraceptive methods and, more importantly, the right to govern their own bodies. The movement for public access to birth control started in the early 20th century, propelled by key figures like Margaret Sanger. She became one of the most influential figures in the birth control movement and a key figure in the start of the pill's history. In 1916, she opened the nation's first birth control clinic and was arrested for distributing information on contraception and put on trial for breaking a New York law. The trial that followed is now considered a watershed moment for birth control in the United States and inspired physicians and researchers to begin seeking better ways to help women plan and prevent pregnancies. Sanger thought that women would never be free until they had the ability to control their own bodies. But her views on birth control were also rooted in philosophies that you might not expect from such a key figure in the birth control movement. Historians contest a long-standing myth that Sanger thought non-white people should be prevented from procreating, but they agree that Sanger supported eugenics, a theory that undesirable populations could be reduced or eliminated by controlling their breeding. In Sanger's case, that undesirable group was the mentally and physically defective. Using the eugenic language of the era, Sanger argued that birth control could help wipe out the greatest present menace to civilization, aka people living in extreme poverty and those with mental illnesses and physical disabilities. The interest to eliminating extreme poverty drove Sanger to look for and invest in more modern forms of birth control. She then met controversial biologist Gregory Pincus, another key figure in this story who specialized in mammal reproduction. Sanger asked him if his work could be used to create a cheap birth control pill, to which he told her that he'd try. This led Sanger to introduce Pincus to Catherine Dexter McCormick, a philanthropist who underwrote what would become one of the 20th century's most ambitious and risky scientific experiments. During that time, the female reproductive system was still largely a mystery to scientists, and birth control was strongly regulated by state laws that made it effectively illegal to search or distribute. Massachusetts, where Pincus began his work in the 1950s, was one of those states. Pincus and John Rock, an obstetrician, began working in secret to figure out if it was possible to use progesterone, a hormone produced by their body during pregnancy, to prevent pregnancy in women. In the lab, it prevented pregnancy in both rabbits and rats, so they thought to themselves if it could also work in women who weren't pregnant as well. This is the question that led them to begin their trials. But Pincus could have been jailed in Massachusetts if the real nature of his research was discovered. So even before the Puerto Rico trials, he first conducted a trial on a small number of women, hiding his research by calling it a fertility trial. But if he wanted to get his drug approved, then he would need a wider clinical trial. Don't go anywhere, we'll be right back after this break. You're listening to the Leo Podcast. I'm Kevin Munoz. Support for today's episode comes from my Patreons. If you enjoy the show and are looking for bonus content and to further support the show, then head on over to patreon.com/latinamericaneo or visit my website latinamericaneo.org to join the growing Leo Podcast community. Because the learning doesn't stop with this episode. There's also some sick merch on my website, everything from shirts, coffee mugs, and tote bags. All info will be at the bottom in the show notes. Now let's get back to today's episode. In the eyes of Pincus and Sanger, Puerto Rico was the perfect place for these trials. During this time, it was in the middle of a population boom and poverty was rampant, but it was also home to birth control clinics that had once been funded by the United States government under New Deal programs. Now, Procter & Gamble's heir and American eugenicist Clarence Gamble funded and ran many himself. So to give you an idea of their ideology, Gamble believed that Puerto Ricans and others living in poverty should all be wiped out to make room for more fit members of the population, and birth control was part of that vision. His birth control centers became recruitment grounds for Pincus's clinical trials. Gamble was even deeply involved in Puerto Rico's policy of encouraging women to undergo sterilization as a form of birth control. As a result, 1/3 of Puerto Rican women were sterilized, many involuntarily, under policies that pressured women to undergo hysterectomies after their second child's birth. What this policy did for Pincus's trial is help create candidates. Educated women didn't want to try the new medication, fearing side effects, but less educated women were desperate to avoid both pregnancy and sterilization. Pincus focused on that group of women during the clinical trials that recruited in the poorest area of San Juan and other cities beginning in 1955. They purposely recruited women for these trials who were the poorest of the poor and had no place to go and short of sterilization, no birth control options, and were poorly educated. Women recounted physicians dispatching their assistants to go door to door throughout the town's slums, telling women that they didn't have to have another child if they took the pills regularly. These women were exploited for their use. While these women didn't know what the drug they were getting would do to them, some also had the responsibility of caring and providing for their families. Margaret Marsh describes in her work how one woman was 30 years old with 10 children and a husband that drank heavily and insisted on daily intercourse, but claimed to be too sick to work. Marsh also described a woman who had 5 children and a husband who was frequently hospitalized for mental illnesses. This shows these women, while trying to provide for their families, were being subjected to this unknown treatment that at many times left them unable to work or even care for their families and children. The women were only told that they would have the opportunity to make sure they would no longer get pregnant and that their families would not be growing anymore, which for these poor and uneducated women was what they felt they needed at the time. Women who took the drug knew that it prevented pregnancy, but had no idea it was experimental or even that they were participating in a clinical trial. And according to the physicians Pamela Verma Liao and Janet Dolan, They weren't given safety information on the product either, and women experienced serious side effects like blood clots and nausea. The drug Enovid used in this trial was a much higher dosage than oral contraceptive pills prescribed today. Modern health practices facilitate prescriptions for birth control averaging about 0.75 milligrams per dose. The original dosing of 10 milligrams is more than 100 times the acceptable concentration of hormones in contraceptive pills today. It was noted that the women who stepped forward to describe the side effects were discounted as unreliable. So despite the substantial positive effect of the pill, its history is marked by a lack of consent, a lack of full disclosure, a lack of true informed choice, and a lack of clinically relevant research regarding risk. And the risk was very real. However, Pincus didn't feel that the side effects like nausea or depression warranted a reformulation of the pill. Their only concern was proving its efficacy. Meanwhile, 3 women died during the clinical trials, but autopsies were not performed on their bodies, and it remains unclear whether those fatalities were linked to the pill. By modern standards, the secretive trials were both unethical and unsafe. Women who agreed to take the drug did out of desperation, but without full disclosure of what might be at stake. But for Pincus, the trial was a success. The high dose of hormones ensured trial participants wouldn't get pregnant, and in the field trials, the pill was nearly 100% effective. Pincus didn't stop testing. A second trial was funded by Gamble, and the pills were also tested on women and men in mental asylums without consent. As for the original dosage from the trials, it was eventually dropped to 5 milligrams after severe side effects were observed, including dizziness, headaches, and blood clots, along with death of the 3 women in Puerto Rico. Despite strong circumstantial evidence that the pill was causing these unexpected deaths, they were not reported for 2 reasons. Firstly, those conducting the trial considered the death to be coincidental. Secondly, autopsies were never conducted on the bodies of the 3 women. On May 9, 1960, the pill was first approved by the FDA as a contraceptive method in the United States, and the demand was immediate. Within 4 years, more than 4 million women had used what was then marketed under the name Enovid. Now, more than half a century later, the pill is the most common birth control method used by women of reproductive age. In recent years, a social media campaign has even formed around the hashtag #ThanksBirthControl. Even though the contents of the original birth control pills were modified after trials due to the dangerous levels of hormones in its content, the discovery and the authorization of the pill made a profound impact on women's reproductive rights in the United States. Women were now able to directly control their own fertility because of the legislation of the pill and the studies that aided in the authorization of the pill. Instead of having to deal with an accidental pregnancy, women were provided the opportunity to delay having children, allowing them to pursue higher educational goals or seek employment. Based on statistics, the pill was considered one of the most transformational developments in the business sector in the last 85 years. Fully 1/3 of the wage gains women have made since the 1960s are the result of the access to oral contraceptives. Despite the benefits that the birth control pill has given global feminism, it is important to understand the trail of negative impacts of the pill that is less talked about. A Puerto Rican woman named Delia Mestre, who participated in the trial unknowingly, was able to shed light on these issues, describing it that it was difficult to understand that the experiments in which she and other hundreds of women served as guinea pigs would ultimately benefit white women of higher socioeconomic status on the mainland of the United States. When questioned about her participation in the experiments, Mestre explains that the experiments were both good and bad. Why didn't anyone let us make the decisions for ourselves? With tears in her eyes, Mestre also states, "I have difficulty explaining that time to my own grown children. I have very mixed feelings about the entire thing." Unfortunately, Mestre and other women who participated in the trials were not given the choice to decide whether or not they wanted to serve as participants in the sexual revolution that had been occurring within the United States. Instead, the bodies and welfare of impoverished women were sacrificed for the benefit of white women and male scientists who considered the pill a milestone in the fields of science and healthcare. Lastly, to close off this episode, let's read off the response to the trials from feminist activists. Alice Wolfson is among the many advocates that critiqued and condemned the contraceptive trials conducted in Puerto Rican women. Not only were advocates challenging the anti-feminist outlooks of both liberal and conservatives within the United States, but also the systematic inferiorization of women through colonial, racial, and gendered structures. Feminist scholar and activist Antonia Darder analyzed the various degrading policies that were enforced following World War II. As explained, women were seen as the means towards the advancement of imperialistic interests held by philanthropists and foreign policy makers. Notoriously, it was the exploitation of poor and working class women's sexuality and reproduction in which forged the crude occupation of the United States in Puerto Rico. Furthermore, feminist Catherine McKinnon scrutinized the hierarchy of power between men and women as a key component in their encroached subjection. Such disparities within Puerto Rico constrained their advancement and rendered them as inferior citizens. In addition, native Puerto Rican women were constantly targeted and discriminated based on derogatory stereotypes considered incapable of socioeconomic achievement. They were often deemed as prostitutes, welfare abusers, and incompetent mothers. This stigma enforced the idea that low socioeconomic communities had the moral obligation to limit and restrict the growth of families with inadequate capability to sustain themselves. This ideology was cultivated by the fears and biases of white pro-birth control groups in the United States who wanted to prevent abusive dependency on social welfare services by poor familial units. Among those culpable in supporting this race suicide discourse, as explained by political activist Angela Yvonne Davis, were white pro-birth control women like Margaret Sanger. Her public statement in support for the implementation of forced contraceptive trials in Puerto Rico is a direct example of the negative rhetoric that harmed minority women. As she argued, morons, mental defectives, epileptics, illiterates, paupers, unemployables, criminals, and prostitutes should be forcibly sterilized or given contraception to limit their reproduction capabilities. As Kimberly Crenshaw would argue, through the theory of intersectionality, which discusses knowledge as the mixture of situation, context, relationship, and reflection of political and economic standing, Sanger exclusively includes women in her remarks since women are also victims of multiple conditions and societal strains at the same time. Due to this discourse, minority women from Puerto Rico were coerced to undergo clinical treatments. In her film, La Operación, Ana Maria Garcia provides these women a platform to denounce the practices. Some women, as seen in the film, were inadequately advised on the procedures, and others argued that they did not have other choices due to the constant coercion. That's all for today on the Leo Podcast. I'm Kevin Munoz, and as always, feel free to send me a message with your thoughts or with any interesting topic that you'd like to see covered. And for those of you on Patreon, I will see you there. Otherwise, I'll see you in next week's episode. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a family or a friend and rate it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps tremendously in order to bring more awareness and educational resources to our community. For more information and to stay up to date with what I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram at LatinaAmericaneo. And if you need more information and resources, you can visit my website, latinaamericaneo.org. I'm Kevin Munoz. This has been the Leo Podcast, and I'll see you next time.